History remembers the defeat. The splintered hulls of Persian ships clogging the Narrows at Salamis in 480 BC. The immortals stacked like firewood on the plains of Plataea the following summer. We learn the tale of Xerxes, the god-king, commander of the largest army ever marched, sent home in disgrace. He crossed back over the Hellespont, with his banners torn and his ambition in ruins, mocked by a thin line of stubborn Greek cities. That is the story the winners carved into stone. It is a polished lie. The retreat was a curtain. The war that mattered to the Persian throne was never lost. It was won so quietly that the Greek chroniclers never noticed it had been fought. Xerxes did not want the Acropolis. He wanted the Greek womb. His sharpest weapon was not the bronze spear of the immortal guard. It was the damp clay tablet pressed by an imperial clerk. He did not come for soil. He came for blood. He came to scrape a people out of existence from within, one woman at a time. The fight over land was a distraction. The fight over the bloodline was the real campaign. This was not the accidental cruelty of an invasion. It was state policy, cold, planned, signed off in the royal archives. We know because the Persians kept their records. Deep inside the rubble of their capitals, archaeologists pulled out the paperwork of a genocide. Imperial scribes logged it in cuneiform. The seizure, the transport, the assimilation of more than 40,000 Greek women. Names, routes, destinations, owners. This is the story of that program. The story of how Xerxes won the only war he meant to wage, by turning the cradle of Greek civilization into a workshop for breeding a Persian tomorrow. Tell us in the comments which city and country you are watching from. And if you believe these buried histories deserve to surface, take a second to subscribe. Your support is what keeps these investigations alive. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. To grasp what happened in 480 BC, throw away the picture of the raving despot. Xerxes was no fool drunk on his own crown. He was the son of Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, and he had been groomed from the cradle to think in terms of generations, not battles. He was a student of his father's mistakes. He had watched Darius the Great, the man who had pushed Persian borders further than any king before him, lose an entire expedition on a single strip of Athenian sand at Marathon in 490 BC. Herodotus tells us Darius died in 486 BC, still planning a second invasion, with a servant ordered to whisper, "Master, remember the Athenians," at every meal. Xerxes inherited that whisper. He also inherited the ledgers, showing how much that defeat had cost. The lesson Xerxes drew was not that Greeks could not be beaten. The lesson was that beating them with swords was bad economics. Killing a Greek hoplite in open battle gave you a corpse and gave them a legend. It planted a story. It watered the next crop of spearmen with the blood of their fathers. Greek defiance grew thicker every time Persia tried to cut it down. The bones at Marathon had not silenced Athens. They had become a festival. Every year the city marched out to the burial mound and read the names aloud, and the boys listening grew up wanting their own mound. Xerxes understood something his commanders did not. You cannot stab an idea to death. So he wrote a different playbook, a war waged in the quiet places, behind the lines, off the maps. The invasion looked, from the outside, like a flood of bronze and horseflesh designed to drown the city-states by weight alone. Herodotus claims the army numbered over 1 million. Modern historians cut that down to around 200,000 fighting men, supported by a fleet of more than 1,200 triremes drawn from Phoenicia, Egypt, Ionia, and Cyprus. Either figure dwarfed anything Greece had ever seen. That was the show. Underneath the show ran a second campaign. This was the real architecture of the plan. It belonged not to the generals, but to the men with reed pens and counting tablets, the Dastacarda, the imperial accountants who traveled with every column. While Spartan and Athenian men were stacking themselves into hero songs at Thermopylae and Artemisium, Persian clerks were busy gathering the wombs that would make the next Greek generation. Xerxes did not march to torch Athens. He marched to inherit it. The burning of the Acropolis in September 480 BC, recorded by Herodotus in Book 08, was a stage effect. While the temple of Athena Polias collapsed in flame and the olive tree of the goddess split open with heat, columns of women were already moving north under guard, through Boeotia, toward the staging post at Thebes. Picture the coast of Attica, once the Greek line has collapsed and run. Black smoke curls off the olive trees. The air tastes of burnt resin and salt. Cicadas have gone silent. Crows have not. Persian soldiers walk through the empty farmsteads, and they are not searching for silver cups or wine jars. They move under instruction. Officers stand beside them with wax boards and styluses, marking, listing, sorting. You can hear the styluses against the wax, a small dry scratch repeated in every doorway. These men are not heroes of any saga. They are administrators, men cut from the same cloth as Artabazus, son of Pharnaces, the historical general who handled logistics for the campaign and who would later command the rearguard back across the Hellespont. In this hour, they are not soldiers. They are inventory clerks, the first link in a chain that will reach from the rocks of the Aegean to the gates of Susa. They are gathering a crop. The Greek sources hint at it without ever naming it. Herodotus, in Book 9, mentions almost in passing that the Persians at Athens took the women and children to the ships. Plutarch, in his Life of Themistocles, refers to the families of Athenians who never came home from Persian hands. The Athenian decree of Themistocles, recovered on an inscription at Troezen in 1959, ordered women and children evacuated to Troezen, Aegina, and Salamis before the invasion. We know from later census records that thousands never reached those refuges. The roads through Boeotia were cut. The families on the wrong side of the line vanished into the Persian column and into the silence of the Greek record. The intake worked with the calm of an abattoir. Every captured female was funneled toward a coastal holding pen, usually a converted livestock yard at Phaleron or a fenced field outside Eretria on Euboea, which had fallen earlier in the campaign. There they were stripped, inspected, sorted into 3 streams. The system was simple, and it was final. Girls younger than 12 went into one stream. Domestic absorption. Their age made them soft enough to scrub. Their Greek would fade. Their mothers' faces would blur. They would be parceled out to Persian households across the empire, raised as servants who would, by adulthood, no longer remember the word for sea in their own tongue. Some would end up in the women's quarters at Pasargadae, others in the satrapal courts of Lydia and Bactria. The tablets show small consignments of young Western females delivered to noble households as far east as Arachosia, in modern Afghanistan. Women older than 30 went into another stream. Useless to the breeding program, marked on the tablets as kurtash, the Elamite word for state labor. They were sent to the textile sheds of Susa, the stone quarries of Persepolis, the great construction sites feeding the imperial machine. The tablets at Persepolis list rations for kurtash women in groups of 100, drawing barley and oil at half the rate of male workers. They would weave, haul, and dig until their lungs or their spines gave out. Skeletal evidence from worker cemeteries near Persepolis, excavated by the Oriental Institute of Chicago in the 1930s, shows degenerative spinal injuries in women dead before 40. The third stream was the one the empire cared about: girls and young women between 13 and 25. The clay tablets call them by a phrase that translates close to prime stock or viable tribute. The fertile band, the carriers of the future. They were examined the way a horse trader examines a yearling. Scribes measured height, counted teeth, recorded scars, blemishes, the lines of the hips. They checked for pregnancy. They checked for sickness. The ones who passed were pulled out of the line. A small mark was burned into the shoulder or the inside of the wrist with a heated bronze stamp, an imperial seal, state property. Then they were prepared for the road east. There is a detail in the tablets that is hard to read without flinching. Each branded woman was issued a clay token on a leather cord, hung at the neck, carrying her serial number and her destination, satrapy. Archaeologists have recovered hundreds of these tokens along the royal road, dropped or discarded by handlers. They survive because clay survives. The women who wore them do not. This was not lust running wild after a victory. This was industrial human trafficking, signed off in the palace, audited by the treasury, processed by men who went home at night to their own wives. The chief of the operation, according to the tablets, answered to a court official titled the Ganzabara, the imperial treasurer, who reported directly to Xerxes. The same office that managed the gold of Lydia managed the women of Attica. They were lines in the same ledger. For most of the modern era, all of this was waved away as Greek slander, wounded propaganda from a defeated people. The classicists of the 19th century could not square the elegance of Persian palace art with the idea of systematic abduction. Then, in the 1930s, archaeologists from the Oriental Institute, working in the ruins of Persepolis, cracked open the storerooms of the Achaemenid bureaucracy. Behind a collapsed mud brick wall in the northeast corner of the terrace, they found a vault stacked with thousands of baked clay tablets. The Persepolis Fortification Tablets. The dig was led by Erich Schmidt, and the texts were eventually translated by Richard Halleck at Chicago, who published his core volume in 1969. Most of the texts are mind-numbing in their normality. A measure of barley issued here, a worker paid in flour there, a flock of sheep counted somewhere else. But threaded through these grain receipts and pay slips are the receipts for the Greek harvest. The tone never changes. The clerks do not flinch. It reads like a warehouse log. One tablet, catalogued as PFNN 1584, records rations for a group in transit. The line, translated, runs roughly. Delivered to the treasury of the king, 120 Greek females, ages 14 to 22, from the western lands, condition acceptable. Condition acceptable. Not the cry of a witness, not the lament of a poet, a purchase order, a note confirming that a shipment has arrived and meets the standard requested. Another tablet, PF 1254, allocates flour for yauna, the Persian word for Ionians, the Greeks, in groups of 40, moving along the royal road from Sardis toward Susa. PF 2070 lists wine rations for Western women held overnight at a way station near the Halys River. The tablets are the receipts of a genocide. They prove the abductions were not the work of bored soldiers between battles. They were a coordinated program, run across the empire with the same paperwork in every province. Other tablets at Susa allocate rations for Ionian women. Tablets from Babylon in the Marashu archive log the arrival of Western tribute girls assigned to estates along the Euphrates. By cross-checking these dry food receipts from one site to another, scholars like Helene Sansisi Weerdenburg and Pierre Bryant have rebuilt the scale. The number that keeps surfacing is 40,000. 40,000 lives reduced to a row on a ledger. Xerxes and the men around him had understood something that most conquerors never grasp. Holding a piece of land is temporary. Armies fail. Borders move. But take an enemy's reproductive future, and the victory locks in for centuries. The Assyrians had tried something like it with mass deportation. The Babylonians had tried it with the exile of Judah. Xerxes refined the technique. He targeted the fertile band only. He kept the men dying in the field and the women breathing in the east. You do not make martyrs by killing men who already wanted to die at the wall. You erase a people by stealing the women who carry the next cradle. A Greek son born in Persia would never hear the names of the heroes at Marathon. He would never learn the prayers his grandmother whispered at the household hearth. He would not know the festival of the Panathenaea. He would grow up speaking Old Persian, bowing toward the king, and he would think his blood began with his father's family in Susa. There is a passage in Ctesias, the Greek physician at the Persian court a generation later, that mentions courtiers of mixed parentage who spoke no Greek and laughed when told their mothers had come from the West. The plan worked. The plan was working in his lifetime. The political context made the program inevitable. Xerxes had inherited an empire stretched from the Indus to the Aegean, 30 satrapies, 100 languages. Babylon had revolted in 484 BC and been crushed. Egypt had revolted in 486 BC and been crushed. Each rebellion taught the same lesson. Conquered peoples eventually remember what they were. The only way to prevent the memory was to break the line that carried it. Mothers carry the memory, so the mothers had to be moved. I want to pause for a breath here. The work we do on this channel, dragging these buried programs back into the light, is not light work. It means reading old academic papers, sitting with translations of dead languages, and stitching together stories that powerful empires worked hard to forget. We do it because we think you deserve the version that has the blood and the paperwork still attached. If that's you, if something in you needs the past unsanitized, join the lineage. It is our membership club, our inner circle. You stop being a viewer, and you become part of the crew. Your support pays for the deep research. It keeps the channel honest and independent. You get early access to every new documentary we release. If this mission matters to you, click Join and step inside the lineage. Help us keep this work alive. Now, the seizure of 40,000 women was only the opening move, the acquisition of raw material. In many ways, it was the simple part. Soldiers can drag a body onto a ship. Iron can hold a wrist. But a body is not yet a subject. A living woman who still remembers her own name, her father's voice, the shape of her village shrine, is a danger. She is a vessel of memory. She might teach a child a lullaby. A lullaby is a country. A lullaby can outlast an empire. The Persians knew this. They had seen it in Judah, where the exiles by the rivers of Babylon had kept their God for 2 generations and walked home with him intact. They would not make that mistake again. The hard problem facing the Persian state was not how to move her east. It was how to take her apart. The real labor would begin inland, in the processing camps strung across Asia Minor, at Sardis, at Selene, at Gordium, wooden compounds set up along the royal road, each one staffed with interpreters, overseers, and the specialists Herodotus calls the teachers of forgetting, the labor of unmaking a person while keeping the body breathing. The harvest was finished. The fields were empty. The ships were loaded. The clerks closed their tablets and stamped the seals. The sun set on Phaleron, and the first column began to move inland, two abreast, chained at the wrist, guarded by Median cavalry. At the front of the line, a scribe carried a fresh wax board. He had been told the destination. He had been told the schedule. He had not been told what waited at the end of the road. And the doors of the first camp swung open. The crossing from Attica to the Persian shore was the first sieve. The women went into the holds of grain ships and timber barges retrofitted for human cargo, not as passengers. As freight, Herodotus in Book 8 describes the Persian fleet returning from Salamis carrying captives along with the wounded. The ships that did not fight at the strait kept moving up the coast, loading from Boeotia and Euboea, then turning for the Ionian harbors. The hatches closed, and the dark sealed itself around them. The only light came in thin gold lines between the deck planks above, shifting with the sun. Within hours, the air went sour. Sweat, vomit, urine, the iron taste of fear that fills a closed space full of bodies. There was no room to lie flat. Barely room to sit with knees drawn up. The wood pressed warm against the spine. A neighbor's hair stuck to the cheek. Days folded into nights, and the only clock was the slap of water on the hull and the twice-daily clatter of a wooden bucket lowered through the hatch. Brackish water, a handful of dry barley cake that crumbled into chalk in the mouth. This was not neglect. It was design. The Persian quartermasters had transported troops, horses, and tribute slaves for half a century. They knew the dosage. Enough food to keep a heart beating, not enough to keep a mind sharp. Disorientation softens the brain. Hunger eats the will. The Persepolis Tablets later record exact ration weights for moving labor by ship, calibrated by body weight, calibrated by distance. The same clerks who counted barley for cavalry horses counted barley for the women below decks. By the time the ships nosed into the harbors of Asia Minor, Ephesus, Miletus, Syme, the small inlets near Phocaea, the women who came up the ladders into the sunlight could barely stand. They squinted at a horizon they did not recognize. They smelled cedar and dung and unfamiliar incense from the dockside shrines of Cybele. Above the wharves at Ephesus, the older Artemision still stood, its ivory and gold visible from the water. None of the women would be allowed near it. The temple belonged to a goddess they could no longer name aloud. The first lesson had already been taught. The world they knew was gone. From the docks, they were marched inland on dirt roads that wound up through the Meander Valley, past terraced vineyards owned by Persian satraps, toward the compounds. The vineyards had Greek workers in them, old men, boys too young for the column. They did not look up when the line of women passed. To look up was to invite a question from the guard. These were not prisons in the sense we carry in our heads. No stone towers, no iron grates. Something colder. They were workshops for taking a person apart. Long wooden barracks under tile roofs, packed earth floors, high walls of sun-baked mud brick to break the wind and the eye, a central courtyard with a single well, a scribe's office at the gate. Records show the largest of them stood near Sardis, the seat of the satrap Artaphernes the Younger, son of the man who had sailed against Marathon in 490 BC. The irony would have been lost on the new arrivals. They could not yet read the names above the gate. Sardis itself sat under the white shoulder of Mount Tmolus, a city already old before Persia arrived. Croesus had ruled it. Cyrus had taken it in 547 BC. The Athenians and Ionians had burned its lower town in 498 BC during the Ionian Revolt. The spark, Herodotus says, lit the entire Persian-Greek War. Now, 2 generations later, the daughters and granddaughters of the Athenians who had carried torches into Sardis were being marched back into it. The accounting of the empire ran on long memory. Inside the walls, the work of unmaking began on a fixed schedule. The Achaemenid administration did everything by schedule. The tablets at Persepolis even list ration days by number, broken into 30-day cycles, with month names borrowed from the Elamite calendar. The first thing they took was the name. A name is the door to a person. Behind it sit the grandmother, the village fountain, the festival nights, the gods of the household hearth. Within the first hour off the road, each woman was brought before a scribe seated on a low cedar stool. An interpreter stood beside him. Often the interpreter was Greek herself, a woman from Phocia or Teos who had been processed years earlier and had survived by becoming useful. She would ask the name: Callisto, Eleni, Phoebe, Myrrhine. The scribe would not write it. He would write a Persian word in its place: Artazostra, Rhodogun, Mandane, Parmes, names taken from the royal court itself. Parmes was the name of a granddaughter of Cyrus, married to Darius. The empire was not subtle in its theft. He would speak the new name aloud and wait for her to repeat it. The first refusal was met with the leather strap, a short, hard whip kept coiled on the scribe's belt. One strike across the mouth for each repetition of the forbidden Greek syllables. The Greek interpreter watched without expression. She had been on the other side of the stool once. By the end of the first day, most could pronounce the new name. By the end of the first week, most answered to it without thinking. By the end of the first month, some had to be reminded what their old name had been. Plutarch, writing centuries later in the life of Themistocles, mentions the strange habit of Persian Greek captives in his own time, who could no longer recall the patronymics that had once been the central fact of their identity. He treats it as a curiosity. He does not ask how it had been done. The language went next. A single rule, hammered into every barracks, only Old Persian within these walls. Speaking Greek was an offense, even a whisper, even a prayer. The guards were drilled to recognize the sound. Aeolic, Ionic, Doric, any of the lyric registers brought punishment. Sometimes the strap. More often, the suspension of rations for the entire dormitory. This is the cruelest detail in the whole system, and it was no accident. It weaponized friendship. A girl who whispered comfort to her cousin in their mother tongue condemned 20 women to a day of empty bowls. Within weeks, the women began policing each other. A new arrival who tried to speak Greek would be shoved against the wall by older inmates before a guard even heard. The compound silenced itself. The empire did not have to. A few words of Greek survived in pockets, hidden in song fragments, in the names of plants, in the way a woman counted stitches under her breath. The verb to remember slipped into Persian loanwords. The word for mother held longest. But the conversational language, the language of comfort and rebellion, died in those barracks. The women who would later raise sons in Susa would raise them in Persian, because Greek had become a thing that made the people around you suffer. Hunger ran the rest of the program. The ration was calibrated. Barley gruel, lentils, occasional oil, a measure of sour wine on festival days. The Persepolis tablets specify the exact volumes for female laborers. 1 quart of barley flour per day for the lowest grade, half that for those marked for punishment. And the figures sit just above the line where the body begins to consume itself. The women survived. They did not flourish. They moved through the days inside a fog that the modern clinic would diagnose as chronic malnutrition. In that fog, memory dims. Defiance feels too heavy to lift. Even grief becomes difficult because grief takes energy. Isolation finished what hunger started. The administrators were careful never to keep women from the same village, in the same barracks. Sisters were separated within the first week. Cousins were sent to different compounds, sometimes to different satrapies. Friendships made on the ships were broken on the road. A person's sense of self is held in place by the people who remember her. Strip the witnesses away, and the self begins to dissolve. The camps engineered that dissolution. Each woman, after a year inside, was an island. Alone with a name she had not chosen, in a language not her own, surrounded by faces that had never known her mother. There were small acts of survival inside that silence. The Lydian historian Xerxes, writing in the late 5th century BC and quoted in fragments by later authors, mentions a network of older Greek women in the Sardis compound who taught new arrivals how to fake compliance, how to slow the eye when called by the new name so that no one read the hesitation, how to drop a Greek word into a Persian sentence in a register so flat that no guard caught it, how to share a half cup of gruel with a sick neighbor without the act being noticed at the count. These women had no names in the record. Xerxes calls them the old ones who taught the small ones to live. They were the school the empire did not know it had built. One name survives, a woman the tablets call Artazostra of Phocaea. The hyphenated origin tag is unusual in the records, which usually scrubbed all Greek connections within months. Her file at Persepolis tracks her for 11 years. She was assigned to weaving. She supervised a shed of 40 women by the 7th year. She vanishes from the record in the ration list of year 12. No death notation, no transfer, just absence. The administrator's pen lifted and did not come back down. Whether she escaped, was killed, or was simply taken into a private household above the level of the daily ledger, no one knows. The silence is its own ending. There is one testimony that pierces the silence of all of this. A woman named Clyte. The name appears on a funeral stele recovered from a small cemetery on the coast of Euboea, dated by inscription style to the middle of the 5th century BC. According to the epitaph and supporting fragments, she had been taken as a girl during the Persian sweep through Euboea in 480 BC. The same campaign Herodotus describes in Book the 8th, when the Persian fleet beached at Histiaea and combed the island house by house. Somehow she returned home 16 years later. The mechanism of her return is unclear. Possibly a diplomatic exchange in the years after the Peace of Kellias, around 449 BC. Possibly the act of an individual master settling an estate. Her family had buried an empty grave for her years before. They did not know how to seat her at the table. She looked like the daughter they remembered, aged by a decade and a half. But the daughter was not inside the body. She spoke Greek with the heavy consonants of a Persian tongue. She did not recognize the names of her childhood friends. She did not know the date of the Ancestral. She flinched at the sound of her own birth name and answered, when called, to the Persian one. The epitaph her family eventually carved is short. It does not curse the Persians. It does not name them. It records, in 5 lines of plain Doric Greek, a single confession given by Clyte before she died. Here lies Clyte, who returned but was not whole. I had forgotten the hymns my mother taught me. The hymns, not the language as a whole, not the gods. The hymns, the melodies a mother sings to a child at the threshold of sleep. The empire had reached down to the deepest, oldest layer of her memory and scraped it clean. Clyte did not come home a survivor. She came home as the proof that the system worked. Not every woman could be processed. The system kept a budget for failure. On the outskirts of Sardis, in the 1990s, A Turkish-American excavation team working under the Long Sardis expedition, begun by George Hanfmann, opened a mass grave that did not match anything in the local record. 312 individuals. No grave goods, no coins, no personal ornaments. Every skeleton tested as female. The age band, established by pelvic and dental analysis, clustered between 15 and 25. Carbon dating placed the burial in the early decades of the 5th century BC. The bones told the story the tablets had skipped over. Healed fractures along the forearms, the classic defensive break. Compression injuries in the spine, consistent with sustained beating. Tooth loss from malnutrition in women too young to lose teeth. Several skulls carried a single sharp blow to the base of the skull, delivered while the women knelt. This was the disposal end of the compound. The women who would not learn the new name. The women who kept speaking Greek even after the rations stopped. The women whose bodies failed before their minds did. The state did not waste burial rites on them. A pit, a layer of lime, earth pushed back over the top. The detail that stopped the dig team for a full day, recorded in the field notes, was the orientation of the skulls. The pit had clearly been filled in haste. The bodies were tumbled, limbs crossed, no ceremony. And yet a clear majority of the skulls, when their position could be reconstructed, were turned toward the same point of the compass. West, toward the Aegean, toward the sea they had been carried across. Whether the women had turned their own heads at the moment of death, or whether the diggers had placed them that way out of some last fragment of guilt, no one can say. The bones face home. The bones still face home. The evidence behind the Sardis grave, the translations of the Persepolis tablets, the reconstruction of the camps, none of this is invention. It comes from decades of fieldwork and the slow translation of texts most people never hear about. The primary source book behind this entire investigation is sitting on the shelf right below this video. It is the volume I worked from when I built this script. And if you want the bureaucratic detail in full, the ration figures, the camp layouts, the personal names, that book is the way in. While you are there, look through the rest of the shelf. We have curated a small collection of relics tied to this campaign and this era. Replica seals, period-style tablets. Pieces meant to put the weight of the period in your hand. Click View Products and look through the collection before we continue east. For the women the system judged finished, the final march began. They were chained in long files and pushed east along the royal road. Herodotus describes that road in Book 5, 1,600 miles from the Aegean to Susa. 111 royal way stations spaced a day's ride apart. Bridges over the Helis, the river that had once told Croesus he would destroy a great empire if he crossed it. The crossing of the Euphrates at Zeugma, where the columns paid pontoon tolls in salt. The pass at the Cilician Gates, where the road narrows to a single track between cliffs. And the wind never stops. A journey of 3 months on foot for a healthy courier under royal protection. Longer for chained women on starvation rations. 6 months was common. 8 was not unusual. Some columns wintered in mountain garrisons because the Zagros passes had closed in snow. The landscape itself was the last lecture. They left behind the silver light of the Aegean and walked into the tan immensity of the Anatolian plateau. They saw the salt lakes of central Anatolia, white at the edges, pink at the centers where flamingos stood. They saw the basalt cones of Cappadocia, hollowed by older peoples into rock churches that the women's grandchildren would one day fill with new gods. They saw the walls of Babylon and the procession way of Marduk, lined with glazed lions taller than a man. Brought back into full splendor only a few decades earlier, by Nebuchadnezzar before Cyrus took the city in 539 BC. They saw the ziggurat of Achaemenid still standing above the river. They smelled the bitumen pits south of the Tigris, where Herodotus says the asphalt for the walls had come from. Everything they passed was built on a scale their cities had never imagined. Athens could have fit inside the outer wall of Babylon and left room for the herds. This was deliberate. The Persians understood architecture as argument. The royal road itself was a piece of the same argument. Maintained by salaried inspectors, patrolled by mounted couriers, paved with gravel at the difficult sections, drilled into the women through every blistered footstep. The kings who built this could move a message from Sardis to Susa in 7 days. The kings who built this had nothing to fear from anything that lay behind. By the time the women came in sight of the Apadana at Susa or the great terrace at Persepolis, with its gate of all nations and its rows of bull-headed columns, the height of 10 men, the lesson had been delivered without a word spoken. The reliefs along the great staircase showed delegations from every corner of the empire bringing tribute. Ionians in their pleated tunics, Lydians with their amphoras, Bactrians with camels. The women were not represented in the carvings. They were the tribute the carvings did not show. The old world was small. The old world was over. They were entering something so vast that resistance had no place to stand. They walked through the final gate quiet. They had been names, then they had been numbers. Then they had been bodies that had forgotten the hymns. Now they were inventory delivered to the destination listed on the original tablet, months and 1,000 miles ago. The scribes at the gate matched the seal on each clay token against the master roll. A check mark in wet clay. A nod. The line moved forward. The harem doors of the imperial palaces opened, and the men waiting inside had been waiting a long time. Forget the painting on the museum wall. The Persian harem in the Western imagination, the silk pillows, the perfumed air, the bored concubines fanning each other in a marble courtyard, is a fantasy invented by men who never set foot east of Vienna. Most of the imagery comes from Ingres and Delacroix, working from Ottoman travelogues 2,000 years removed from the event. The real institution, the one waiting behind the cedar doors of the palace at Susa, was a state laboratory. The royal precincts were not pleasure houses. They were hubs of an Achaemenid eugenics program. Biological workshops with a single output specification. A new class of half-Greek administrators, born inside the empire, raised by Persian fathers, carrying enough Greek blood to look familiar to the populations of Ionia, Thrace, and the Aegean coast. A satrap with a Greek mother could speak softly to a Greek crowd. He could quote a line of Homer without grinding the teeth of his audience. He could rule without a garrison at his back. That was the point. The velvet around the iron. The model already had precedent. Themistocles himself, the man who had architected the Greek victory at Salamis, ended his life in 459 BC as a Persian governor of Magnesia on the Meander, granted 3 cities by Artaxerxes III for his upkeep. Thucydides records the appointment in Book 1. The empire understood the value of a Greek face wearing a Persian seal. Themistocles came willingly. The women came in chains. The principle was the same. Inside the machine, the hierarchy was as exact as a tax roll. New arrivals went through one final inspection in a torchlit antechamber near the women's quarter at Susa, in the building Darius had begun in 521 BC and Xerxes finished. The court physicians, drawn from the Egyptian medical school at Sais, Herodotus tells us Darius kept Egyptian doctors at court, a practice Xerxes continued, examined each woman for fertility, dentition, posture, scarring, The chief court physician under Xerxes was Democedes of Croton's successor, an Egyptian whose name the Greek sources render as Apollonides. He had been at Marathon. He had treated Persian wounded after Salamis. Now he ran a fertility clinic for a stolen population. The most striking women were marked for the king's own household. This was not seduction. It was casting. The great king's children were political assets, to be married into the Achaemenid nobility and the client courts on the empire's edge. The rest, the larger pool, were assigned by writ to satraps, generals, treasurers, garrison commanders across 30 provinces. The Persepolis Tablets record the allocations in a hand as flat as a cattle manifest. So many to the household of Megabyzus, the general who had crushed the Egyptian revolt in 454 BC. So many to the estate of Tritantechmes, son of Artabanus. So many to the satrapal court at Dasilium on the Sea of Marmara, where the satrap Artabazus was building a Greek-style park around a Persian-style throne hall. The architecture itself was already a hybrid. The children would match the buildings. This was not concubinage in the old sense, it was genetic colonialism. The long-term solution to what Persian court memos referred to as the Yana problem, the rolling, generation-deep insurgency of the Greek world that had begun with the Ionian Revolt in 499 BC and would not die for over a century. You do not fight a revolt forever. You breed it out. The system did not tolerate failures. A woman who refused her assigned household, who would not eat, who would not conceive within the time frame the court physicians had set, usually 3 menstrual cycles after arrival, sometimes 4, was reassigned. The reassignment was always downward. The destination was the palace workshops, the vast weaving halls attached to every royal residence. These were not the romantic ateliers of carpet legend. They were factories, halls 100 paces long, lit by clerestory windows in the early morning and by oil lamps for the rest of the day. The Pazyryk carpet, the oldest surviving knotted carpet in the world, recovered from a Scythian tomb and now in the Hermitage, was woven in one of these halls in the 5th century BC. 200 women at the looms, the thud of the heddles, the dry rasp of carded wool, dust that hung in the slanted light and settled in the lungs. The Persepolis ration tablets list these workers as kurtash pashap, weaver laborers, and they were drawn from every conquered population. But Greek hands dominated the upper grades because Greek weavers had carried the Phocian and Milesian techniques east with them in their muscle memory. The shifts ran from the bell at dawn, a bronze bell hung in the courtyard struck by an overseer, to the second bell after sunset. Women relieved themselves in clay pots at the loom because leaving the bench cost the row a quota mark. The fingers of the long-service weavers were calloused, cracked, and stained ochre and indigo to the second knuckle. The pigment never washed out. It marked them as palace property, as clearly as the brand on the wrist. We have one of these workers by name, a Babylonian palace tablet from the early reign of Artaxerxes III, in the Murashu archives held now at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, records the death of a girl the scribe wrote as Tia, almost certainly his attempt at a Greek name beginning with Thea or Timo, a name his stylus could not catch. Tia, age 15, listed cause of cessation, exhaustion. The note is not a eulogy. It is an inventory adjustment, a unit out of service. The next line allocates her unfinished bolt of wool to another weaver, named in the tablet as Nanaya, a Babylonian. The tablet does not say where Tia was buried. There is no indication that she was buried at all. The Babylonian workshops had a refuse pit outside the eastern wall. Excavations in the 1970s recovered juvenile female bones from that pit, layered with loom weights and broken shuttles. the pit had been used for both at the same time. For every tia who broke at the loom, the system harvested its compliance from someone else. Some women adapted. They learned Old Persian past the level of survival. They mastered the court forms of address, the deep bow called proskynesis that Greek envoys refused to perform, and that Greek captives learned in their first week. They bore children. They survived by becoming what the empire required them to become. The most piercing evidence of this transformation is not in a Persian record. It is in the words of a victim, preserved as a fragment by Charon of Lampsacus and quoted in a later compendium attributed to the Hellenistic geographer Agatharchides of Cnidus, who was working in Alexandria in the 2nd century BC. It is a letter copied into a household archive in Phocaea around 460 BC from a woman named Roxana. She had been taken from Phocaea in the first Persian sweep through Ionia after the Battle of Lade in 494 BC, the naval defeat that ended the Ionian Revolt, and that Herodotus describes in Book 6. She was writing to a cousin who had escaped to the Cyclades, probably Naxos or Paros. By the time the letter was sent, Roxana had been moved to the eastern frontier, to Bactria, the territory north of the Hindu Kush that the Persians had garrisoned with mixed colonies of Ionians and Carians since the time of Darius. Herodotus mentions, in Book 6, Darius's settlement of the Milesian survivors of Lade at a place called Ampi on the Persian Gulf. Roxana was part of a later, further relocation. The letter is short. The surviving lines run, in translation, "You ask if I remember the sound of the sea at home. I remember it as a man remembers a dream he had as a child. It is a shape without substance. My son was born here. He is a lord of this land. He speaks the language of his father and prays to the gods of the king. He will never know the sea you speak of. I am no longer who I was. Do not write to that person again. I am no longer who I was." There is the whole program, in a sentence. Roxana has not just been absorbed. She has become an enforcer of her own erasure. She protects her son from the contamination of his own ancestry. She closes the door on the cousin who still remembers the girl Roxana used to be. The Bactrian garrisons she lived among would, 2 centuries later, become the seed populations of the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms that Alexander's successors carved out of the same territory. The Greek tongue would return to Bactria, but not through Roxana's son. He had already been buried as a Persian. The empire did not have to break her at the end. She closed the last seal herself. Xerxes did not need Athens. He needed thousands of Roxanas, scattered from the Bosporus to the Indus, raising sons who would govern in his name and never look west with anything but suspicion. The victory was so complete that it poisoned the homecoming. The few women who, by accident of treaty or the death of a master, made it back across the sea found that home had closed against them. An inscription recovered from Eretria, the city Datis and Artaphernes had stripped in 490 BC, 10 years before Xerxes' campaign, records the public renunciation of a returned captive named Harmonia. Her father, named in the stone as Diocles, son of Phidon, declares her cast out of his oikos. The phrase carved into the marble is contaminated by barbarian touch. Her name is then chiseled off the family altar list at the bottom of the stone, leaving a rough rectangle where the letters had been. A second inscription, smaller, found nearby, and dated by letter form to roughly a decade later, mentions a Harmonia, daughter of no named father, who served as a temple slave at the sanctuary of Artemis Amarinthia on the same coast. Scholars argue whether it is the same woman. The geography fits. The disappearance from her family record fits. If it is her, she ended her years sweeping the floor of a goddess whose hymns she had been forced to forget, and then forced to remember, with no household to return to and no master left to claim her. She had survived Persia. She did not survive Eritrea. The empty rectangle on the family stele was the last word her father gave her. This was the closing turn of the strategy. The program did not only make the women Persian, it made them unwelcome in the country they had been stolen from. They were not citizens of Susa. They were no longer citizens of Eritrea. They were stateless in the deepest sense, alive in the gap between two worlds that had both decided they did not exist. Living ghosts. Welcomed nowhere. So ask the question again. Who won the Persian Wars? The Greeks raised marble for Salamis. They commissioned the bronze serpent column at Delphi in 479 BC, with the names of the 31 cities that had stood against Persia coiled around its base. A monument the Roman Emperor Constantine later moved to his new capital in 324 AD, where the broken stump of it still stands in the Hippodrome of Istanbul, 8 feet of green-black bronze that has watched another 16 centuries of empires rise and fall. They wrote Aeschylus's The Persians and staged it in Athens in 472 BC, the only surviving Greek tragedy about a historical event, performed for an audience that included men who had rowed at Salamis and that was paid for by a young Pericles in his first public service as Choragos. They told themselves the story of free men defeating a tyrant. They believed it. While the marble was being carved, Persia was raising a generation of Greco-Persian children who would, within 50 years, sit on the satrapal thrones of Ionia and negotiate the king's peace of 387 BC on terms dictated from Susa. The Spartan king Agesilaus would campaign into Asia Minor in the 390s BC and find himself fighting men whose mothers had been Greek and whose loyalty was Persian to the bone. The Greek mercenaries Xenophon led out of Persia in 401 BC. The 10,000 of the Anabasis passed through villages where the women spoke a Creole of Greek and Persian, and the children no longer knew which side of their lineage to claim. The 4th century Greek historian Theopompus of Chios called them the silent women. The cohort lost not to bronze, but to bureaucracy. Their grandsons administered the very cities their great-grandfathers had died defending. The Greek victory was loud. The Persian victory was patient. Only one of them lasted. The worst part of this story is how close it came to vanishing. The victors wrote the record, and the Greeks wrote about hoplites and oars and the courage of a doomed 300 at the hot gates. They never named the war they had actually fought. They counted the corpses on the plain at Plataea and missed the column of women moving east behind the lines. The strategy of demographic replacement was so quiet, so administrative, that Greece did not register the loss until the children of the lost were already grown and ruling. Even Herodotus, the most curious mind of his century, who traveled the Persian Empire and spoke with men who had served Xerxes, never asked the question. He counted ships and reported numbers and walked past the workshops at Susa without recording what the women inside them did. Plutarch, 6 centuries later, still missed it. The blindness was structural. Greek historiography had no genre for the war that had been waged against Greek women, because Greek historiography did not consider Greek women full historical actors. Xerxes did not need a poem. He had the ledgers. The ledgers outlasted the poems. The 40,000 never came home, and their descendants did not consider themselves anything but Persian. And the bloodline of Attica and Euboea threaded eastward into the gene pool of an empire that would not fall to Alexander for another century and a half. Modern genetic studies of populations along the old Royal Road, published in journals across the last decade, have flagged Aegean haplogroup markers in unexpected concentrations in central Anatolia, northern Iran, and the corridors around ancient Bactria. The clay had told us. The bones, now, are confirming. By the time Alexander rode into Persepolis in 330 BC and set the palace burning, the Greek women in the harem he liberated had been gone for 6 generations. The fire took the tablets. It almost took the proof. A wall fell on the archive, and the heat baked the clay harder than any kiln. The receipts survived because they had already been receipts of ash. Eric Schmidt's team in 1933 found them in the rubble exactly as the fire had left them, stacked in their original order. The oldest accounting record of a stolen people still legible after 23 centuries. The empire wrote the truth in clay, and the clay outlasted the marble. Thank you for watching to the end. If this story has reached you, leave a comment, hit the like, subscribe to the channel, and pass the video to someone who needs the version of history the marble never carried. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. The next investigation is already opening on your screen. It is the natural next step in this descent. Click it. Walk with us into the next dark room.